Good evening, and welcome back to our continuing series on the Siddur, on the prayer book. And we're now focusing on the morning prayers, specifically what is called Birchos HaShachar, the morning blessings. These are the preliminary prayers and blessings that we say before we really get into the meat of the morning service. These morning blessings are designed to get us to acknowledge what God gives us as we awaken every morning. To not take the things that we do, the things that we have the capability of doing, for granted. And it starts off with first a declaration of gratitude for being alive. Then we go into more specifics about the nature of our body, the nature of our soul, that we're grateful for both body and soul and their interaction, because a human being is not a body, a human being is not a soul. A human being is a composite of the two, and I'd just like to dwell on this for a few moments, because this relates to all of our classes, and the entire structure of Judaism is based on this notion that our identity as human beings is one that requires the synthesis of body and soul, which is unique in creation, because every creation, everything that God put into existence, was put into existence in one statement. When God said that there should be animals, the animal body and its soul came into existence simultaneously. When God created a human being, He created a body, a lifeless body. And then, the Torah tells us, He blew a soul into the body. What does that tell us? And this is something that we mentioned in an earlier class briefly, is that the human being is a paradox. Because the body the human being has is lifeless, is the lowest body in all of creation, because all other bodies have been created with a soul, with a spiritual identity of some nature, true, very limited nature, but still not just a lifeless clod of earth. A human being is just what we call in Hebrew a golem, a just piece of clay. The soul, on the other hand, the human soul, is the highest of all existences. There is no other creature that has what we have in our human soul. So we have the ultimate, most spiritual, the ultimate physical, and that is what a human being is, a composite of the two, which leads to a perennial struggle and a challenge that the soul and the body learn to coexist in a way that the body does not hamper the soul. On the contrary, the soul edifies, refines, spiritualizes, if you will, the body and the physical existence. So when we're grateful to God in the morning, we're grateful, of course, for the body separately and for the soul separately, because they're two distinct beings. And then we're grateful for the amalgamation of the two, the synthesis of the two, the fusion of the body and the soul, which gives us our capability to fulfill the mission for which we as humans were created. With that introduction, we then go into a series of blessings. After we thank God for our body, for our soul, for the two together, we then thank God for the things that happen as soon as we wake up. The first thing we do is to wake up, so we thank God for giving us the ability to know the difference between day and night. Actually, we thank God for the rooster, the alarm clock, or for the deeper meaning, the inner dimension of our soul that gives us the ability to discern between night and day, evil and good, power of discernment. Then we thank God and we say thank you for opening our eyes. That's not only literally that we can open our eyes and physically see, but it's that we have the ability to see spiritually, to see beneath the surface, to see the context, and so on. So those are two intellectual gifts for which we are grateful. The power of discernment and the power of vision, of intellectual vision. Then we thank God for freeing the bound. Physically, it means that we're able to move around. We're not paralyzed, God forbid. And when we experience that in the morning, we should be thrilled. We should be exhilarated. Just go visit people in the hospital or in nursing homes who are confined to wheelchairs and cannot move. We should be grateful for that in a very simple, literal sense. But there's also a deeper meaning. Sometimes our emotions could be locked up, bottled up. We can't express ourselves. Our emotions, if we can't express them, we sometimes express them the wrong way. We express our love for things that are unworthy of our love, and we express anger at things that we shouldn't be angry at, and so on and so forth. So we thank God for giving us the ability to emote properly. And likewise, the next blessing, where we thank God for straightening the bow, that we're able to stand straight. And standing straight means, on a deeper level also, that we're humans, where the intellect is above the heart. That means that the mind controls the emotions, and the emotions that are tempered by the mind then control the rest of our existence. So these are the blessings that we thank God for: the ability to understand, to discern, the ability to emote properly, and to have the proper balance in our lives. Now we go on to the next blessing. Blessed are you, God, our God, King of the universe, who clothes the naked. Malbish arumim, clothes the naked. Very simply, you don't need to be very creative to figure out what this blessing is about. After a person wakes up and stretches and moves around and stands up straight, we get dressed. And we're grateful to God that we have clothing, because one of the necessities of life is to be clothed. That's something that began since Adam and Eve were in the Garden of Eden, that we as human beings are clothed beings. And we'll soon get into a deeper understanding of the clothing, but on a very basic level, we're grateful that we have this clothing that protects us, that gives us modesty, dignifies us, and for that we are grateful. There are people who don't have clothing, people who don't have the ability to dress in appropriate ways, that suits their needs and their stature in life. So we're grateful for that. But then there are also deeper meanings. But before we go on to the deeper meanings, just wanted to note that in the Talmud, the order is inverted. They thank God for the clothing before thanking God for standing up and moving around, because in those days, people would sleep without clothing, and because of that, they were not considered to be appropriately clean, because they might have touched parts of the body that is normally covered, and they couldn't really say the prayers, so they first would have to get dressed before they would say the blessings. But nowadays, when people go to sleep with clothing, pajamas or whatever, we say this blessing afterwards. Okay, so let's get into a deeper understanding of this blessing. When was the first time clothing came into existence? Adam and Eve were in the Garden of Eden, given a commandment that though they could eat from any tree in the garden, they could not eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. They could not resist the temptation. The serpent enticed Eve. Eve fed Adam. And the rest, of course, is history. That we, as a result of that sin, experienced humanity, the world experienced a sense of degradation, of degeneration, and that brought death to the world, physical death and spiritual imperfection, and so on and so forth. So the idea of garments, because that's what happened after they sinned. They realized they were naked, and they put on some fig leaves. Then God gave them a little bit more comfortable garments, of leather garments, and they symbolize man's frailty, man's weakness in the face of temptation, and our limited nature as human beings. So, on one hand, garments represent something very negative. And the Talmud, quoted by Rashi, when they wake up from their experience of having tasting that fruit, it says Vayedu, and they knew ki rumimhem, that they were naked. And Rashi, quoting the earlier sages, asks, even a blind person knows that he's naked. What does it mean that he knew? As if it was a feat, an intellectual feat. And Rashi says, no, there's a deeper meaning. Yes, of course they realized that they were naked, but they realized that they had one mitzvah, one divine commandment, and they lost that. They blew it. They were now naked without any mitzvahs. They had no mitzvah. Their nakedness, their physical nakedness, was a manifestation of their spiritual nakedness. We find also in the Talmud that King David was once bathing, and he felt naked in the spiritual sense, not just in the physical sense, because he realized that he didn't have any mitzvahs on him. Usually, the king in those days would wear tefillin all day long. They were surrounded. They were in a house, in a room that had a mezuzah on the doorpost. They wore a tallis, a four-cornered garment with fringes. So King David was always covered up with mitzvahs. But in the shower, he didn't have any clothing on. The shower doesn't have a mezuzah, and of course no tefillin. And he felt that he had no mitzvah, and he felt very, very strongly about that until he realized, but I'm circumcised. So that the Jew, even if he's not in a place where he can do any mitzvah, by virtue of the fact that he is circumcised, he has a mitzvah all the time. So a Jew can never be totally naked. A Jew always has that mitzvah connected. Well, so we see from here that nakedness is a metaphor, and not just a metaphor, but there are two parallel levels of nakedness. There's a physical nakedness and a spiritual nakedness. And Adam and Eve's recognition of their physical nakedness, that it was a problem, was a result of their spiritual nakedness. Okay, so now that we know that nakedness means that we're bereft of mitzvahs, that we don't have the cover of those divine commandments that envelop us, that give us spiritual energy, we wake up in the morning and we say to God, God, thank you that you have given us the opportunity to dress ourselves physically, but also spiritually. That this gives us a little bit of a different understanding of Adam and Eve's putting on the garments, because if you really think about it superficially, garments are negative, because they came as a result of Adam and Eve committing a sin and bringing degradation to the whole world. In fact, the word for garment in Hebrew, one of the words is beged. Beged is related to a Hebrew word that means boged, to be betray someone. It's a betrayal. Garments became a symbol of Adam and Eve's betrayal. But the truth is that it's a positive symbol, not a negative symbol. Because the fact that God gives us the opportunity to cover ourselves after we've done something to expose our weaknesses and our frailties and our immorality, that is God's power to give us the ability to atone for our sins and to cover up our nakedness. So the garment, while it is a result you could think of a negative, it's not really a negative thing. Therefore, we say to God, God, thank you that you give us the opportunity to put on our garments, physical garments. But these physical garments are a manifestation of the spiritual garments that we have that enable us to cover up our nakedness, cover up our vulnerabilities, cover up our weaknesses, and to stand strong. Let's take this a step further. The human soul has many layers. The Tanya, the classic work of Chabad Hasidus, explains that the soul has kochos, faculties, and levushim, and garments. There are deeper parts of the soul as well, but that's not our discussion here today. We're focusing on the faculties of the soul versus the garments of the soul. What are the faculties of the soul? Faculties of the soul are the soul's powers. The power of intellect, the power of emotion. These are the faculties of the soul. They are more or less identified as the soul, even though relative to the soul's essence, these are not the essence. But we're now talking in relative to the garments. This is who we are. This defines who we are. Our faculties tell us what kind of a person, what level of understanding, what level of emotion. A person who doesn't have intellect, has no IQ, a person who doesn't have any ability to emote, can't have relationships, can't be expressive, is not a full human being. But that's not the full story. In addition to the faculties of the soul also has garments. The way the Tanya describes them, they're garments. They're not the soul itself, they're peripheral aspects of the soul. What are the garments of the soul? Machshava, dibur, masa. Thought, speech, and action. These are garments. A garment is something that envelops you. It's not you, but it's very close to you. And if you really think about it, when we look at the human body, the skin can be seen as a garment. It covers the more important parts of the body, the blood vessels, the bones, the nerves, and so on and so forth, the internal organs. So you can have different kinds of garments. You can have a garment that is a part of you, like the skin is a part of us, and you can have garments that are, you can put them on, take them off. Well, thought is like the skin to the body. It's a garment, but it's something that is so much a part of us, you can't just stop thinking. A human being is always thinking, consciously, subconsciously. There's always a thought process going on. What does thought do? Likewise speech, likewise action. It takes your intellect or your emotions and it gives expression to them. Just like a garment takes the contours of your body and gives expression to them. If you're 6 feet tall and your garment is only capable of covering part of your body, it's not really a garment. It won't protect you. If it's too long, you'll trip over it. It's not a garment. The garment has to be tailor-made to your contours. Well, in a similar vein, what does your speech reflect? It reflects your level of knowledge or lack of knowledge, reflects your emotions. If the words of speech are loving words or words of hatred, it tells you something about your emotions. So thought, speech, and action are the garments of the soul. Now, which is more important to a human being? Having intellect or thinking? You could have intellect in theory without thinking, though in practice we're always thinking. But you can't think without an intellect, without emotions. Speech requires ideas that you're thinking about, whether it's intellectual ideas or emotions. Likewise, action has to be based on, even an animal's action is based on his desires, based on his feelings, based on his understanding of what's good for him, for it and its brood, and so on. So the garments are really inferior to the faculties of the soul, that make up the soul itself. Tanya says that that's not necessarily the case when it comes to the godly soul, because the godly soul, its means of connecting to God is primarily through the garments, by thinking Torah, saying the words of Torah or other positive things like prayer, acting in a Torah-oriented way, doing the mitzvahs, putting on tefillin, and likewise all the other mitzvahs that require action, most of which do require more than this thought or speech. When you do any of those things, what you're doing is you're allowing the mitzvah, God's will, to envelop you. that becomes your garment. Your garment is not just any thought, it's divine thought. It's not just any speech, it's divine speech. Not just any action, it's divine action that surrounds you and encompasses you. And divine action, divine speech and thought is superior to the faculties of your soul, even of your godly soul. Because once your godly soul comes into this world, a lot of its light is lost. But Torah and mitzvahs never lose their light. So when you think, speak, do Torah and mitzvahs, you are connecting to God and you're elevating your soul way beyond the faculties of the soul themselves. Okay, so what does it have to do with this blessing? When we wake up in the morning, we just said that we're thanking God for our intellect, for our emotions, but really, there's not much intellect going on in the morning. You didn't have your coffee yet. You didn't really have time for your mind to clear up. You're still in a daze. Things are still hazy. Your emotions, you're not able to express yourself adequately. You can't really speak the way you really want to in terms of your emotions being expressed properly. So when you wake up in the morning, there's an expression in the biblical expression, neshama ba'apo, the soul is in your nostrils. The soul hasn't yet fully permeated your body, your consciousness. But you know what? We didn't lose the most important thing, because we can always put on our garments. We can always do a mitzvah. Even early in the morning, you can do a mitzvah. You can think the right thoughts, say the right words, do the right thing. So though you don't have your intellect and your emotions intact, fully developed, fully expressive, your garments are very much there, and they are what really counts. Tanya goes on further to explain that even if a person has the deepest understanding and the most powerful feelings for God, that's not what we came into this world for. That's important, that's necessary. We came into this world to make the world into a dwelling place for God, and that we accomplish by taking the physical world and making that godly by doing the mitzvahs that are mostly physical actions, and many other mitzvahs that are not physical in terms of your hands, but they require speech, which is also an action. So that's what we're thanking God. God, thank you that you gave us clothing, that you gave us these garments, these spiritual garments, the ability to think, speak, and do mitzvahs that elevates our soul, elevates the world, and lets us accomplish our purpose even before we have our full soul in an active mode. Another way of looking at this blessing based on Hasidic thought is that God sends the soul into this world, and we already made mention to the fact that God has to protect our soul. There's an aura that envelops the soul like a garment, apart from the thought, speech, and action. It's something that comes from above. But when we go to sleep, that aura leaves us, and it comes back to us in the morning. So we're thankful for that. Yet a third understanding of this blessing, taken from the Tzemach Tzedek, the third Chabad Rebbe, who explains that when we awaken, as I mentioned before, we don't really feel the full effects of our godly soul. Because, as I said before, we just got up. The soul hasn't yet fully penetrated. So it's very hard for us to really do something consciously spiritual, because we're not yet fully equipped. Yes, we could still do a mitzvah, but even that's not so easy, because we're just getting up in the morning. We're not fully aware of what's going on. There's not that much we can do in our bedroom when we just woke up. But yet, there's one thing that we can do. There's one garment, so to speak. Even though we lose our garments, we feel naked. But nevertheless, we have one thing that we can do, and he calls that Kabbalas Ol, translated as accepting the yoke of the heavenly kingdom. What that means is that when we talk about serving God, we have various levels. We have a person who serves God because he understands God's greatness, understands the need to serve God. We have someone who serves God based on an understanding of the value of each mitzvah. Then there's someone who has this feeling for God, an emotional tie and connection and attraction to God, loves God, is in awe of God. Most people have to work a lifetime to develop these feelings and this understanding. And even if we have them, they're very limited. But there's one thing that every person can have, and that is accepting the yoke. Recognizing that God is our creator, whether we understand it or not, we just accept it. That's the foundation of all of Judaism, the acceptance. When the Jews were standing at Mount Sinai and they were offered the Torah, unlike the other nations that asked for a sample, they wanted to listen and hear and judge and decide. The Jewish people said the famous words, Nasa v'nishma, we will do it, and then we'll hear and understand. That is the foundation, the prerequisite. So when we wake up in the morning and we're naked in every sense of the word, we don't have physical garments, which are a manifestation of our spiritual garments. Our soul is not intact. It hasn't fully permeated our body. We didn't have the opportunity to do mitzvahs. But yet we could still accept the yoke of the heavenly kingdom and say in our mind, as we say this blessing, thank you, God, for giving us the opportunity to have you envelop us. Because once you accept God's kingdom, God's authority, God's sovereignty, he envelops us. And that's the foundation of the whole day. One final approach to this. God, whatever he tells us to do, he does as well. He tells us to put on garments. The garments, physical garments, spiritual garments. God also has garments. When God creates the world, he creates it through his garments. It's not God's light that shines there. On one hand, it actually, the person, you're seeing the person in a garment. Well, that's how God, when he gives off his energy to us, we don't really see God's true essence because he cloaks it in garments that conceal. So the question is, why is that such a positive thing? When we say in the morning, God clothes the naked, we could say that that's a metaphor that God also, when he shines his light to us, he does it through a filter, through a curtain, through a veil, through a garment. He screens his light and filters it. Why is that such a good thing? Because if God would not filter the light, if he would not screen his light, then the light would be too powerful for us, and it would overwhelm us, and it would destroy our ability to be independent beings who could accept God's authority and sovereignty volitionally, because we, with our own free choice, accepted God as our king, accepted God as our authority. So God needed those garments in order for us to fulfill our purpose in this world. And it's interesting that the beginning of humanity started with God providing garments for Adam and Eve. Because if they wouldn't have had those garments, they wouldn't have sinned, they wouldn't have degraded themselves, humanity would have been a perfect species. And God would not have a reason to create us. He has angels that are perfect beings. So what's the point in having physical angels who don't have an evil impulse, don't have a challenge, don't have any temptations, don't have a struggle? So the metaphor of the garment is the metaphor of God wants a world, a finite world, an independent world, a world in which God's light is screened. In the Messianic age, it says, "V'lo yikanef od marecha," your master will no longer be covered up with garments. We will be able to see God's being without any filters. But right now, we're in the mode where God needs the garments. We need those garments in order for us to be able to absorb God's energy without being overwhelmed by it. The question could be asked, well, if garments are really a screen, they're really a cover-up, they're necessary, what about in the Messianic age? Will we need garments then? Or will we then be able to go without clothing, back as in the good old days in the Garden of Eden, when Adam and Eve did not need clothing? And the answer is most likely we will still need garments. First of all, in the Torah it tells us that a Kohen, a priest in the temple, would wear garments, priestly garments. And they're not there just to cover up for modesty purposes, but it's there in order to bring out a new level of dignity and glory. L'chavod u'sefaros. His garments, the Torah says, are for glory, honor, and beauty. A garment conceals, but a garment also enhances. So yes, if they hadn't sinned, they wouldn't have needed the garments, but they would have also not had the positive aspect of the garments. The garments are not just there. As I mentioned at the very beginning, there are three functions of a garment. One is for purposes of modesty. Another is for protection, especially when we're subjected to different extremes, weather extremes, cold or heat. Well, and the third is it adorns the person, it beautifies the person, it enhances the person, gives dignity. Rabbi Yochanan, the great Talmudic sage, would call his garments mechabdusa, that which gives me honor, my honor. So it follows logically that in the Messianic age we may not need it for modesty purposes, because we won't have any yetzer hara, any evil impulses, we won't be distracted, we won't be tempted by anything. We may not need it even for protection from the elements, because there'll be climate control, I suppose, in the Messianic age. We'll all be living in a perfect climate where we won't need to be protected from the elements, perhaps. But we still will need garments because of the positive aspect of the garment. In the Messianic age, even the concealment will be seen as God's power. Because in truth, as explained in Tanya, God has two powers. He has the power of revealing, creating, and the power of concealing. And the power of concealing is no less a power than the power of revealing. Because for God, who is in everything, to obscure his presence is as much a feat that only God can do, as much as it is that only God could create something out of nothing. Right now, we look at concealment as a limit to God, as God's absence, as it were, to our eyes. In the Messianic age, the garment will not be seen as the absence of God, it'll be seen as part of God's power. Just like God sees his power of concealment not as a limit to himself, but part of his infinite power to do everything. A famous Kabbalistic term that I think I referred to last week, that God is perfection. If you say God is only capable of doing infinite things, but not finite things, then you're really saying that God lacks in his perfection. Well, in the Messianic age, we will see that the garment that limits is really as divine as the garment that reveals, and it won't be an impediment. It won't be a concealment anymore. And therefore, it'll only serve the function of bringing God's glory out into the open. So when we say God clothes the naked, this refers also to the Messianic age, when our nakedness, our vulnerabilities, our limits will be covered up, not in a negative way, but in a positive way, in a way that will bring more glory to every one of us, because we will be revealing God's glory. God willing, we'll continue the series of blessings next week. Please stay tuned.